Michael Oren, it's an absolute pleasure to be in your office today here in the Knesset, and you were Israel's ambassador to the United States. You are now serving in the Prime Minister's office as a deputy minister, and you are by far one of Israel's most articulate spokesmen. So thank you for the incredible work that you've been doing, standing up for Israel and the Jewish people.
Thank you. My pleasure and my honor. Thank you.
Michael, can we talk about your father? Because your father was a soldier during World War II. He took part in D-Day and also in the Battle of the Bulge. What impact did your father's experience in defending Europe have on you as a child growing up?
My father was one of 4 brothers who fought in the war. He and his brother landed on Normandy and fought all the way across Europe. And during the course of their struggles, they liberated a concentration camp in Germany. And my uncle took photographs of the piles of burnt bodies. And those photographs were put into an album. And I grew up in a working class neighborhood outside of New York. I was the only Jewish kid in the neighborhood, and I encountered anti-Semitism virtually daily. Got into fist fights, learned to fight, use my fists at a very early age, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And I would come home beat up, and my father would take me down to the basement. American homes have basements, and he would open this dusty album and show me pictures of the bodies of the Nazis, laughing over the bodies. And he'd say, "You see that? You see that? That's why we need a strong Israel." So it had a profound impact on me. By the way, I carry those pictures in my cell phone wherever I go to remind me of those moments. I grew up during the period of the Six-Day War, where, in retrospect, we think, oh, Israel won this outstanding victory. But before the war, American Jews, not just American Jews, were convinced that they were going to witness a second Holocaust in a single generation. And that's what I remember most about the war.
What impact did meeting Israel's ambassador to the United States, then, the famous Yitzhak Rabin, who went on to become Israel's prime minister?
Well, I as a child, I joined a Zionist youth movement, like a good Zionist youth movement. We didn't visit Israel, we visited Washington, D.C. We went to the Capitol building, we went to the White House. I actually don't remember very much about that, but I do remember one meeting. It was with Israel's ambassador to the United States. I got to shake his hand. At that moment, I vowed that that's what I wanted to be when I grow up. I wanted to be Israel's ambassador to the United States, which is a rather unusual vow to make, because I hadn't even visited Israel yet and didn't speak Hebrew. But that's what I wanted to be when I grew up. His name was Yitzhak Rabin, the ambassador. He was the great hero of the Six-Day War. Later became prime minister. Later I would move to Israel, serve in the military, and I'd become advisor to Yitzhak Rabin.
Incredible. And you also served in the Lebanon War in '82. Can you share with us your experiences of fighting in that war?
For every soldier has his own war. My war was a particularly brutal one. My unit fell into an ambush on the second day of the war. Everyone was either killed or wounded. I managed to get out of that one, but went on to spend something of like a year of my life in combat in Lebanon. I think it had a profound impact on not just my military thinking, but my diplomatic thinking, that Israel must avoid unnecessary wars. I think there was an unnecessary war, ultimately. Certainly the second stage of it, which was the siege of Beirut, which was a brutal affair. But it toughened me and prepared me for Israeli politics in general. I think you have to be tough. And it became the first of several wars I participated in. I was also in the second Lebanon War in 2006, as well as several operations both in Lebanon and in Gaza.
And you also were a spokesman for Israel, weren't you? During was it the disengagement of Gaza?
Yes. And during the operation in Gaza in 2008, which is a military operation, what happened was that I was a paratrooper. You reach a certain age where they stop throwing you out of airplanes, and at that point I could have retired from the military entirely. But they came to me and said at that point I'd already been interviewing into the international media as an historian and a commentator, and they said, "Would you like to sign on for 10 more years?" And be a spokesman for the military. And I said, okay, fine. It turns out I probably saw as much, if not more, combat as a spokesman for the military. And it was, first it was great preparation for being ambassador, because I got to interview thousands of times, not hundreds of times, thousands of times, under the most stressful circumstances, including literally being under fire while being interviewed. One case I remember in 2008, being on a hilltop that came under fire, and I was on a live program, a very large live program in the United States, and the entire staff went dashing places, and I was left with a microphone, and I couldn't leave the screen, so I had to stay there. In another case, I was actually interviewing for a Gulf TV station, and a rocket came in, and they tried to untangle me from all the wires, and I said, forget it, you guys run. And they ran, and then I finally ran, dragging most of the camera equipment behind me. And we all jumped into the same hole. And here I was, an Israeli officer with a group of Arab journalists from the Gulf, all huddling from a Hamas rocket, entangled in all these wires. So it was an extraordinary experience, and I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
And of course, you had the greatest honor to be Israel's ambassador to the United States. What was that like, and what were the problems associated with that role, particularly as we know that President Obama was pretty hostile towards Israel and his policies?
Well, generally speaking, there really is. It is a truly singular honor to do this. I was being the ambassador from my homeland to the land of my birth, and I knew America well. I knew the American political system well. I knew the American military very well. I'd grown up on various bases. These were big advantages. Die-hard football and baseball fan, you would be surprised as someone from the UK just how much football and baseball terms, as American football, enter into the American vernacular.
Yes.
I'd have to give my own staff sort of a crash course on what out of left field means, and what a lateral pass means, so that they could understand what was going on in diplomatic discussions. On one hand, it was one of the most challenging, perhaps the most challenging period in the U.S.-Israel relationship under President Obama, who had a profoundly different worldview from my own prime minister, but probably from any Israeli prime minister. It's a worldview that saw the Israel-Palestinian issue as the core conflict in the Middle East. It saw the settlements in Jerusalem as the core of that conflict. It was reaching out to the Islamic world, reaching out to the Palestinians, and ultimately reaching out to our ultimate enemy, which was Iran, and making a nuclear deal which desperately threatened our security and perhaps even our survival. Can you imagine having that type of relationship with an administration? But, and this is a big but, the U.S.'s relationship is probably the deepest and most multifaceted relationship which the United States has had with any country in its post-World War II period, because it's founded not just on strategic interest and now economic and technological interests, shared democratic values, but there are also deep spiritual ties between the two. America is a very religious country.
Absolutely,
still,
yes.
And people go to the Bible, they read the Bible. God made a promise to the Jewish people to inherit this land, and there are millions and millions and millions of Americans who know that God doesn't lie. So that becomes a strong pillar in the relationship between the United States and the American people and Israel. And that pillar was very prominent in our relationship with Congress, because Congress really reflects American domestic opinion. And overwhelmingly, during that period, I was able to bring crucial aid for Israel's Iron Dome project, for other anti-missile systems, and to ensure that Congress stood behind us on issues like delegitimization, when we confronted enemies to the north and south, and ultimately, I think, on the Iran deal as well.
Yeah. And your current role as a Deputy Minister in the Prime Minister's office, what does that involve? And what is it like working with Israel's most long-standing Prime Minister in history?
We don't think about that. We just think of him as the Prime Minister. By the way, I never call him anything other than Mr. Prime Minister, okay? I guess it's the American me. My father, the soldier, used to say that American soldiers don't salute the person, they salute the rank. Okay. Israelis don't actually salute anybody, but but they certainly don't salute the rank. But I do call him Mr. Prime Minister, and I'm particularly involved in diplomacy. The Prime Minister is also the Foreign Minister. He has his hands full being the Prime Minister, so there's plenty of work to do in diplomacy. I host foreign leaders. I engage in negotiations. Sometimes I travel abroad. I've traveled abroad several times to the UK for meetings. Last night I gave a briefing to 30 young British diplomats from around the Middle East and gave them my perspective, our perspective. In addition to that, I promote the development of the Golan Heights, which has been in our hands for 51 years, that we haven't developed it very much. And it's the Israeli presence on the Golan Heights is crucial not only for our security, but for the entire region's security. Absolutely. It's what's stopping the chaos in Syria from moving downward into Jordan and into the Gulf. And it's important that Israel develop that region as an indivisible part of the land of Israel and the state of Israel.
Fantastic. That's great. What do you say were the biggest security challenges facing Israel? Would you say it's in the north with the increasingly precarious situation in north with Israel's border and the Golan, the fact that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's forces are 30 miles from the Golan Heights, and the ongoing civil war?
We face a phalanx of security challenges. Okay, we have in Iran, which is trying to gain regional hegemony. It's moving missile capacities into Iraq that can hit us from there. Iran itself has a missile capability of striking us from Iran. The Iranians have given something in the order of 130,000 rockets to Hezbollah. They're all aimed at us. They haven't fired a single one in the Civil War. They're all aimed at us. About 10 to 15,000 rockets in the hands of Hamas. One was fired into downtown Beersheba a couple of hours ago. Very serious threats. But I must say this, that with all these threats, the terrorists know that with tens and thousands of rockets, they can cause severe damage to our economy. Maybe tourists won't be visiting here so quickly, but they can't destroy us. They're not going to wipe us off the map. They can wipe us off the map. They can cause us strategic damage, perhaps even existential damage, by getting us to hit them, because they're going to use their own people as human shields. The 130,000 rockets in the hands of Hezbollah are in some 200 villages in southern Lebanon. The houses have rockets in them. The roof opens up, the rocket goes out, and Hezbollah knows full well that in order to neutralize those rockets, we're going to have to hit the houses. And so we'll be accused of war crimes. And we'll be dragged into the Security Council, we'll be dragged into the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and there our right to defend ourselves will be taken from us. And ultimately, the goal of the terrorists is to get our right to exist taken to us. And I see the steady erosion in our legitimacy and our ability to defend ourselves. We can have, right now the Israeli army is slightly bigger than the British and French armies combined. And we have a wonderful army, motivated soldiers, a citizens' army.
Absolutely.
But without diplomatic space and time and legitimacy, our tanks won't roll, our planes won't take off. Now, the enemy knows this, and they are very patient, and they will go through war after war after war, cutting away, eroding us. The recent demonstrations in Gaza along the border are doing precisely that. They are designed to get us to incur casualties among Palestinian young people so that we look terrible on television. And now when I go on, say, the BBC, I find that the BBC has completely internalized, completely adopted the Hamas narrative, that Israel is Israeli soldiers are firing indiscriminately and wantonly at innocent Palestinian protesters who just want food. That's the Hamas narrative. By the way, they never mention the word Hamas. But the Israeli narrative, which is our soldiers are charged with defending a border against 40, 50,000 people who want to break through that border and murder hundreds, maybe thousands of Israelis who are right on the other side of that border, and they have no choice. When these demonstrators come up to the border and tear gas and rubber bullets are in effect, they have no choice but to use live fire. That narrative does not gain any audience whatsoever. No credence. That's the erosion. That's the danger that we face.
But isn't there a great danger, for example, I mean, Israel knows very, very well the military capabilities of these terrorist entities, whether they're Hamas or whether Hezbollah. But the fact is that our mainstream media, whether it's CNN or BBC or Sky, play into the hands of the terrorists, but also then undermines Israel's position and standing in the world. How important is it that journalists realise that they are being a pawn in a bigger game?
When I interview with the BBC, for example, one of my major points I'll say is, and I'll say to them quite, expressly, you understand that Hamas wants this interview to take place. This is precisely what you are operating as basically an accessory to terror. Why? Because Hamas is going to send young people up to that fence, hoping they get killed. Hamas pays $500 per gunshot wound. They want them to be shot. And they know, why are they doing this? They want Israel to be delegitimized, to be vilified, to be isolated in the world. They want us to be sanctioned, to boycott. That's how they're going to bring us down. Not with protests along the border, but through sanctions. And they will see this interview with the BBC where you have adopted the Hamas narrative, where you are vilifying me and my country. And they're going to say tomorrow morning, let's do it again. And frankly, Mr. and Mrs. Interviewer for the BBC, if Palestinian children are killed tomorrow, their blood is on your hands.
Absolutely. absolutely. But also has an impact on foreign policy, doesn't it? Western governments in particular, particularly Europe. It's
particularly Europe. We have to distinguish the rest of the world from Europe, and particularly Western Europe today, not Eastern Europe. Our biggest diplomatic challenge in the world today, believe it or not, is Western Europe.
Oh, and why do you think that is? Is this ingrained anti-Semitism? Is this anti-Israel bias? Or is this wanting to build a strong relationship with the Arab and Muslim world on behalf of the European Union?
It's probably all of the above. There's large Muslim populations in Europe that have an impact. These are democracies, and they have constituencies. I think that's more or less understandable, okay, for democracies. There is a post-colonial guilt, which for some reason we become the way for, somehow relieving that guilt. And yes, anti-Semitism. And I have to say that anti-Semitism predated it predated Christianity in Europe, and now it is continuing after Christianity. Europe is very much post-Christian. The EU took a decision several years ago not to cite Christianity as one of the sources of European identity, and yet they still refer to Jerusalem as a sacred city for Europe. Sacred for what? Sacred for French socialism? Sacred for European German social democrats? I don't know. Yeah. But it's so deeply, deeply ingrained. And when, for example, European nations like France vote for a Security Council resolution that accuses Israeli soldiers of shooting indiscriminately and disproportionately at innocent Palestinian demonstrators along the Gaza border, never mentions the word Hamas, not one word of it. What is that but a repeat of a medieval blood libel that said that Jews shed the blood of innocent young people? To me, that has very deep historical resonance and reverberations. I hear it very, very clearly.
Michael, I want to talk about my nation, Britain. It's extraordinary to think that we've got a leader in Her Majesty's opposition who's the head of the Labour Party, who can't mention the word Israel. And we see the rise of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. And the prospects of him becoming Prime Minister absolutely frightening. What are your thoughts in terms of future relations with Britain, and knowing the incredible military cooperation between our two nations in terms of trade? What do you think the impact of Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister will have on Israeli-British relations?
Okay. I've spent a fairly large segment of my life in the UK. I work there in London, and I'm an historian, and I know that anti-Semitism has been deeply ingrained in the English, not just the British, past. In many of the cases, some of the expulsions and the inquisitions that occurred in Europe in later centuries happened first in England. And there was a long period of time when there were no Jews in England, from about the 13th century to the 17th century, no Jews in England at all. It was a problem in Britain. I encountered it myself, but it was always considered something that was not done. It was unfashionable, and for a large segment of the population, it was thoroughly unacceptable. And the great quest for the rebirth of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel in many ways began in England in the middle of the 19th century. Some of the greatest proto-Zionists were British, and the people who taught us how to fight. I'm a big fan of Ord Wingate, who was really the father of the Israeli army, taught 5 of the 6 of our first chiefs of staff of the IDF. We have a tremendous debt to people like Wingate, who were actually Scottish, but fought in the British Army. A huge debt. What is occurring in Britain is profoundly upsetting with Labour Party. And I would be remiss if I didn't share with you my concern about it. Whether Mr. Corbyn can win an election, he actually be the Prime Minister, and I have deep concerns and even doubts about the future of our diplomatic relationship. Something that would not, our trade relations are such, they're superb. Israel will be essential for Britain's economy into the 21st century. The Israeli auto industry receives something in the order of 200 times the amount of foreign investment that the British auto industry receives, though we don't make a Bentley, we don't make a Rolls-Royce, we actually don't make a single automobile. Foreign investors are interested in the 500 companies here that are working on automotive autonomous driving, which would be essential for the British industry, for the British economy. in defense, our cyber capabilities. We punch about 200 times above our weight. Israel, with 0.02% of the population of the world, accounts for 20% of the investment in cybersecurity. So we're vital for Britain's security, vital for Britain's economy. There are 270,000 Jews in the UK. So we have all these connections. These connections will be jeopardized should this rank anti-Semite become the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And so, yes, I'm concerned, and I hope that we can get through this painful chapter.
Michael, what is it like to have a president like President Trump, who it almost appears as if he's geared up his entire foreign policy to support the nation of Israel and the Jewish people? For example, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over your eternal capital, Jerusalem, pulling out of the UNRWA, suspending finances to the Palestinian Authority, and also suspending their diplomatic mission in Washington. What are your thoughts now on the strength of relationship between the United States and the nation of Israel?
Well, let me say again, unequivocally, this is the friendliest administration Israel's ever known since its founding in 1948. And the friendship is not just personal with the president. It's his Secretary of State, it's his National Security Advisor, it's his ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, who'll be ambassador to the end of this year. It's a deep friendship, and our strategic cooperation is more multifaceted and deeper than ever. And we have to be very grateful for that. Among the list of historic moves which the president has done that redound to Israel's benefit and security is the withdrawal of the United States from the Iran nuclear deal, and leading the effort to change that deal and make it a very much better deal and end the Iranian threat not just to Israel but to the entire Middle East and I believe the world. I think that we have to be very, very grateful for that. Having said that, I cannot but be cognizant and sensitive of the deep political polarization in the United States. And there are no small amount of people, including no small amount of American Jews, who will oppose whatever the president does because the president does it. Unbeknownst to many here, the majority of American Jews opposed moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, for example, opposed recognizing Jerusalem as our capital, opposed withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. And I would be fairly confident in saying that if President Obama had done these things, they would have been overwhelmingly supportive. These American Jews are not necessarily opposing this because Jerusalem is not our capital. They're opposing it because the current president did it. And it's very important for me when I speak to American Jewish audiences, as I do pretty regularly, to say the president also wants peace. Peace between Israel and the Palestinians, peace between Israel and the entire Middle East. I am deeply convinced of his sincerity and of his staff, very serious staff. It will not be easy for Israel. We'll have to make some serious sacrifices.
I've been attending a fantastic conference called the Christian Media Summit, organised by the Israeli Government Press Office and the Israeli Foreign Ministry, to really show solidarity and support for Christian journalists around the world who love Israel and want to stand with Israel. Can you share with us the strength of depth between the evangelical Christian community and the nation of Israel?
Well, it's an historic bond. Several years ago, I wrote a book called Power, Faith, and Fantasy. The book that dealt with America's relationship with the Middle East going back to George Washington in 1776. And it was over the course of researching that book, I came across an interesting word called restorationism, which appears actually in England in the 17th century. It was an idea that was very prevalent among the Puritan pilgrims who came to New England in the early part of that century and took root in the United States. And what's that belief? That to be a good Christian and ultimately to be a good American, one had to fulfill God's desire for the Jewish people, and that is to see them restored to their ancient land of Israel as a sovereign nation. And early Christians took this very, very seriously. So I wrote about this in the book, and I began to find so much restorationism that I almost had to give it a separate book. And I published the book, and it did very well in the United States, but it was very controversial because of this part. And I think since over the course of the last decade, the realization that evangelical Christians, not just evangelical Christians, I find this among Catholics as well, take their Bible very seriously. In the United States, particularly where there is a greater percentage of the population that goes to church every week than in any other country in the world, people read their Bible, they take it seriously, and where God says, those who bless my people will be blessed, absolutely, they take it very seriously. And that has an immense impact on foreign policy. And it has been my experience. So then, as a diplomat, as a statesman, I've seen it actually working. I've seen it implemented. I would go to Congress. I'd walk into an office of a congressman from West Texas, whose district was sometimes maybe 5 times the size of the state of Israel, probably didn't have a lot of Jews in his constituency. He'd have the Bible open to the book of Genesis, to that passage, those who bless my people will be blessed. He says, you see that? You see that? I says, I believe that. And how much aid do you want for Iron Dome?
Amazing.
Just like that. And the first couple of times it happened, I was surprised. Oh my God. Then I got to be kind of used to it. I understand that this was hardwired into the American consciousness, hardwired.
My final question, Michael, what role can our viewers who have a tremendous passion and love for Israel and the Jewish people play in standing with the nation of Israel at this time?
Well, first of all, defend us. Defend us because we are defamed. I mentioned earlier how our narrative doesn't gain an audience in much of the international media today. We've been delegitimized, systematically delegitimized. It's a serious threat to our security, even our survival. Stand with us. Understand that Israel represents your values. And, you know, Israel in many ways is the ultimate success story and model for the 21st century. We are a country which reveres our past, respects traditions, okay? Deeply embedded in faith, and yet we are the world's leaders in innovation. Usually the two don't go hand in hand. We are one of the few countries in the world that has never known a second of non-democratic governance. By the way, along with the UK, we can count them on one hand. Though we're the only country in that list that's never known a second of peace, but we're also a country with that army that defends us. And that's usually a contradiction. Having a vibrant democracy and having a very strong military usually doesn't go hand in hand, but we show that model. We show a model for a world that is short on water, and we show them how to make water. We're the world's leaders in water reclamation and desalination. We show you how to make, you know, a desert bloom. We are a model for so many ways. We are a model of a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious society. It works. No troops on our streets. Go out there. Compare it to Paris. Compare it to Brussels. We are the model. So understand that and appreciate that model. Reason what Israel means to me, whether I'm in the UK or in France or in, you know, Angola or in Uruguay, what it means to me. And lastly, come here. You know, I mentioned briefly in my remarks to the conference on Christian writers that during the Second Intifada, from 2000 to 2005, when bombs were going off in Jerusalem, I would often come back to the United States on El Al planes, and I would be the only Jew on the plane because nobody else was coming to Israel except for the evangelical Christians. It was amazing. The whole plane would be evangelical, and that kind of faith that our Christian friends throughout the world have stood by us when just about everybody else stood aside. And I'll never forget it. And I'll, you know, that's why whenever an evangelical group comes through this building, I find time, believe me, I find time to say thank you.
Well, Michael, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to give me this opportunity to interview today. And can I say on behalf of our viewers, we're standing with Israel, we're standing for the Jewish people, and we will do what it takes in order to show our solidarity and because of the righteousness of Israel's cause. And I'd like to see you become Israel's next foreign minister. I think you'd be a fantastic candidate for that job. And thank you for the dedication and the service that you've done for your nation and your people.